My name is Marten de Groot. I'm the National Secretary of PEFC the Netherlands, which means I have been responsible, and I am responsible for all our national standards and the implementation of the standards. So that means mostly the forest management standard, and in this case also the trees outside forest management standard. Trees outside forest is a concept that is mostly nationally designated. So it's a government who decides what is a forest and also what is outside forest. In our case, so in the Netherlands, it was actually quite difficult because we do not have that much forest, and we had a forest law which recently changed into a natural protection law or nature protection law. But this old forest law was saying that a forest was 21 trees standing in a row, which is what you get if you are living in a country with not so many forests. So that definition was actually already including quite a lot of what we would perceive as trees standing outside of forests. Normally people that are walking on a street with trees next to them, 21 trees or more, would still not think that this is a forest. So we thought of a different definition of forest than our government actually uses in order to apply this law, because it was not applicable for us to use the requirements for sustainable forest management in these circumstances where you have 21 trees standing next to each other in a row or more, especially next to a road. You can imagine that if you want to have a requirement on the amount of deadwood lying in a forest, which we have, that is not really applicable or safe if these dead trees are standing next to a road and can fall anytime. So that is why we changed the definition, and we actually used the definition of the Wageningen University and a Dutch forest research organization called ProBos, who are both responsible for providing the national numbers to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. So based on this definition, they are providing the amount of hectares of forest to the FAO, and therefore we thought it would be good to use the same definition as they use, because then it is actually more clear what is actually a forest and what is not a forest. So if you know what a forest is, then you also know what is not a forest. And in that case, if there are standing trees on these land areas that are not a forest, that's automatically being called trees outside forest. So in our case, that means land surfaces smaller than half a hectare, or if it's bigger than half a hectare, then you have to take into account the tree coverage. So if the tree coverage is lower than 30%, then it's a trees outside forest area. This is a very simplistic way of saying so it's a bit more complicated than this, but in the very essence, this is what it's mainly about. So certification for trees outside forest can be really important because of two things, basically. The first one, and it's maybe the most important one, is that governmental organizations, but also large companies, sometimes also other companies, are nearly always demanding certified material. Interestingly, in the Netherlands, half of the trees are standing outside of forest. So what we are saying right now, if we didn't include trees outside forest, is that half of the trees that are standing in the country cannot be used by governmental organizations, cannot be used by companies demanding certified material, which is nearly all of them, especially companies who are using wood in, for example, buildings or other, let's say, long-term materials. There, the obviously the CO2 is stored for a long time, but we always require them to be certified. So builders want to have it certified, and therefore it would be a pity if we cannot use this wood that is coming from trees that are standing outside of forests, which in the Netherlands is half of the trees. So yes, through certification we basically open up more markets for these owners of the trees that are able to sell them to more markets. Then the second point is that municipalities, so in this case, municipalities own quite a lot of trees. They are the owner of of most of the trees standing in cities. And they also often encounter problems with the management of these trees, not only in the management itself, but also in the communication of this management of the trees. And obviously, a certification can help them in communicating about what sustainable tree management in this case means, and what this municipality is doing in making sure that these trees are actually managed in a sustainable way, and they can prove it through third-party certification, which is a great communication tool as well. So our tree certified forest standard is more or less, well, the concept is more or less based on the international standard, which means that we are coming from a forest certification background, which also means we just take the requirements from forest certification and we see if it is applicable to trees outside forest, and if it is not, how it can be applicable for trees outside forest. So what is the essence of the requirement? And does this essence of the requirement also make sense in the trees outside forest context? And if not, how can we still kind of take the essence and apply it to trees outside forest? And so for these, in these circumstances where we had to change the requirement, we created a table at the end of the standard, and we said, for example, criteria 1.3 in the forest management standard is saying this and this and this and this. And for trees outside forest, you can interpret this requirement as this and this and this and this. So if you look at into our specific national circumstances, we distinguish two different ways of trees outside forest certification. The first is in agricultural use. We actually say outside the built environment. So it's more or less all the trees standing outside the cities or villages that are not forests. And specifically for these trees, we are, for example, also stating something that it is important to also use good agricultural practices. So to not only say something about the tree management, but also a little bit about the agricultural use. Of course, it's also really important that you use different tree species. Something that we adapted from the forest management standard. And if you are standing next to some kind of lane and you see the same species everywhere, every time, that is not the goal of our trees outside forest standard. So we try to encourage landowners to also introduce different tree species. Recently, I've heard of a new lane here in the Netherlands that is using different tree species next to each other. So every tree that is standing next to the other tree is a different species, which is quite interesting. Obviously, you have to take into account the growing circumstances and whatever. So it's not in all cases applicable, but we try to encourage it through our standard. In cities, we developed, or we actually used a concept that has already been developed for specifically trees in the urban environment. And so we say that a trees outside forest manager or landowner shall aim for a so-called 10-20-30 split, which means that 10% of the total amount of trees should be of the same type, 20% should be of the same genus, and 30% should be of the same family. And in this way, we try to encourage these owners to use different tree species that are also adapted to the growing circumstances, of course. And most of the municipalities in the Netherlands do not have this yet. So we also say that they have a transition period of 40 years to include this concept. So that after these 40 years, you can say that you have reached the 10-20-30 split. So an owner of a tree or trees can apply at a group management level or at certification body level for the certification of their trees. It's possible. So in the Netherlands, we mainly focus on municipalities for the settlement part of the trees outside forest standard. And for the agricultural part, we focus on private landowners. Actually, one of the private landowners that already had forest certification is currently being audited, all for also its trees outside forest. And hopefully we'll get their certificate soon as well.